let's dive straight into the thick of it. We're looking at the Sophists within what's often called the 5th century Enlightenment. Thinkers like Guthrie saw parallels between this ancient Athenian period and the 18th century Enlightenment: empiricism, skepticism, rationalism, all that jazz. It's a useful comparison, highlighting those modern-sounding elements. But, and there's always a but, this comparison has been wielded like a club against the Sophists. Zeller basically said they were the Greek Enlightenment thinkers, sure but superficial, dangerous, and ultimately paving the way for Socrates to clean up their mess. Even today, you can hear echoes of that. Their important history of ideas, but not really philosophy proper. Now, calling them just history of ideas isn't wrong, it's just broader than philosophy. Their world wasn't just about logic and ethics, it was messy, practical, and touched everything. But here's the rub: if we push that Enlightenment analogy too hard, we risk making these ancient folks sound suspiciously modern. We might miss the weirdness, the uncomfortable bits of their thought that don't quite fit our neat categories. Plus, let's be honest, using Enlightenment to say one era is better than another is fraught with peril. Both the 5th century BCE and the 18th century CE had plenty of unenlightened attitudes towards large swathes of humanity. So maybe we need a different lens. So, can we still use Enlightenment? I think so in two key ways. First, it captures a real phenomenon. These guys were acutely aware that things were changing intellectually. There was a buzz, a sense of rupture, a questioning spirit. It wasn't necessarily about reason winning out over superstition, but more about everyone feeling the ground shifting beneath their feet. This self-awareness, this epistemological modesty, doubting what was once taken for granted, is a hallmark of that period. Second, Enlightenment helps us zoom out. It reminds us that the Sophists weren't just philosophers in a narrow sense. They were part of a much wider cultural conversation. Their work spilled over into rhetoric, politics, education, law. The culture was pre-disciplinary. Thinkers like the Sophists weren't confined to one box. They were the characteristic thinkers of their time, embodying the intellectual ferment of the 5th century Enlightenment. Okay, so how do we study this? Our job here is to connect the dots between the famous Sophists Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, et al., and this broader Enlightenment vibe. We need to show how their ideas and activities resonated with things happening outside the philosophical ivory tower. Why does this matter? Because it shows how blurred the lines were back then. Philosophy wasn't some separate kingdom, it was deeply intertwined with other forms of discourse. And honestly, tracking the exact origin or spread of any single idea is like trying to follow a specific drop of water in a storm. It gets lost in the sheer volume and overlap. What's more telling is that maybe these big names didn't even have fixed doctrines. Instead, they were masters of method, experimentation, provocation, dialectic. They tackled huge questions, but often left them open, focusing on the process rather than delivering a final answer. So our focus should be on their approaches, their methods, their ways of thinking, rather than pinning down a single correct idea. And where do we get the best glimpse into this world? Aristophanes' comedy, Clouds. Forget Plato's polished dialogues or Xenophon's more straightforward accounts for a moment. Clouds is raw, it's contemporary, it's dripping with the anxieties and excitement of the time. It gives us a panoramic view of the intellectual landscape. Crucially, unlike Plato or Xenophon, Aristophanes isn't trying to defend Socrates or establish a proper school of philosophy. He's satirizing it. This lack of agenda makes Clouds incredibly valuable. It shows us how these new ideas were actually perceived and understood by the wider Athenian public. And while we debate whether the Socrates in the play is the real deal, for our purposes he's a stand-in, a figure representing the kind of novel, sometimes unsettling, intellectual energy shared by many, including the Sophists. So, let's use Clouds as our starting point and trace some threads outwards to the Sophists and beyond. We're going to look at three distinct ways of thinking that emerge from this context. First, the drive to research, to collect information, to synthesize knowledge. Second, the art of arguing both sides of a question, a skill famously associated with the Sophists. And third, critically examining beliefs about the gods and divine causality. These aren't exhaustive, but they represent crucial points of contact, showing how the Sophists fit into the larger intellectual picture of the 5th century. By mapping these modes across different fields, we can really understand what this 5th century Enlightenment meant in practice. First up, research and collection. These weren't just armchair philosophers. Late 5th century intellectuals were busy gathering information, conducting investigations, contributing to fields way beyond formal philosophy. Look at Aristophanes' Socrates in Clouds. His interests seem centered on nature, especially the skies. He's described as scrutinizing the sun, investigating the moon's paths, even having students who learn to astronomize with their backsides. Now this clashes with the Socrates of Plato and Xenophon, who famously denied ever getting interested in meteorology. Maybe it's a hangover from Socrates' earlier association with Anaxagoras, the controversial thinker exiled around the time Clouds was first performed. But regardless of biography, the play presents a Socrates deeply engaged in empirical inquiry, even doing experiments like sticking wax shoes on fleas to measure their jumps. Beyond nature, there's also a strong interest in social sciences, particularly language, which feels much closer to the core sophistic turf. This focus on the heavens, the ta meteora, is super significant in Aristophanes' world. When Socrates claims the clouds are the real gods, or when the chorus calls him and Prodicus celestial sophists, they're tapping into a powerful association. Being linked to the study of the stars and planets wasn't just about astronomy, it carried connotations of impiety. Think about Anaxagoras again. He was condemned partly for teaching accounts concerning celestial things, which likely included challenging traditional views of the gods. So, associating someone with the meteora was a way of saying, hey, this person is thinking dangerously new thoughts, possibly questioning the divine order. Eupolis, another comedian, uses a similar tactic. While the link might sometimes be generic, Aristophanes gives it a specific, almost comical, visual. Socrates contemplating the sun, his students learning to astronomize. It frames this intellectual pursuit as both cutting-edge and potentially subversive. Okay, so did the actual sophists spend their nights gazing at the stars like Aristophanes' Socrates? Probably not as much as the play suggests. Firm evidence for them as astronomers is thin. However, they absolutely engaged in natural scientific inquiry. Take Antiphon, for instance. His work on truth covers an astonishing range: astronomy, biology, medicine, geometry, the nature of matter, human culture. It's arguably as broad as Parmenides or Anaxagoras, maybe even broader because of its focus on ethics. Gorgias, in his On Not Being, dives into fundamental nature, engaging directly with the Eleatic school. Protagoras had a reputation for geometric insights, and Cicero mentions him along with Prodicus and Thrasymachus, writing on the nature of things. Hippias? He pops up with knowledge of astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, music. So, while Aristophanes' portrayal might exaggerate the physical science angle compared to some sophists, it wasn't entirely out of left field for the intellectual climate of the time, especially considering figures like Archelaus or Diogenes of Apollonia. But perhaps even more striking than their supposed astronomical pursuits is the sophistic interest in human culture, particularly language. This is where Aristophanes' Socrates really shines, and it feels much closer to home for the sophists. The play shows him offering to teach Strepsiades about measures, words, rhythms. This immediately brings Damon of Oas to mind, a real figure known for musical theory and advising Pericles. But the focus on words and language is undeniably sophistic. Socrates gets into this extended, almost obsessive, discussion about which animal names are correctly masculine and which are feminine. It's all about matching the ending of the word to some felt sex. Now this sounds absurd, and Aristophanes probably intends it as parody. But it perfectly mirrors what we know about Protagoras and Prodicus, both of whom were interested in orthoepia, correct speech, and related concepts. It highlights how sophistic inquiry into language relied on collecting data, analyzing usage, and consciously grappling with the relationship between theory and empirical observation, even if the conclusions were, shall we say, unconventional. So whether they're studying fleas or word endings, what drives all this activity? Research, collection, synthesis, gathering information from various sources and trying to make sense of it. This fits squarely within the broader 5th century practice of historia, which we usually associate with Herodotus and medical writers, but appears elsewhere too. The methods are diverse: direct observation and experiment, sure, but also deep dives into cultural details like linguistic patterns or musical scales, and comparative studies of customs across different peoples. Herodotus himself is a prime example. He tackles the physis versus nomos debate, engages with contemporary political theory, and shows us eclectic interest in natural phenomena that echoes the natural philosophers. Much of this work seems driven by a polymathic impulse, a desire to gather all available knowledge on a topic and present it systematically. This reflects that Enlightenment self-awareness, the belief that this era offered unprecedented opportunities to expand knowledge quantitatively. Yet, this very breadth could be criticized. Heraclitus mocked Pythagoras for being a mere collector, and Plato famously skewers Hippias for his superficiality. This criticism itself shows the debate was alive and kicking. Was this new way of doing knowledge good enough? Speaking of collectors, let's talk about Hippias. The guy Plato paints such a miserable picture of him in his dialogues. You'd almost forget he was apparently a hugely successful, well-traveled figure, a kind of intellectual rock star of his day. Trying to understand him, I think, requires looking less at his fellow sophists and more at someone like Herodotus. Like Herodotus, Hippias was a polymath, deeply involved in that physis versus nomos debate. We have clear evidence he did historical research compiling lists of Olympic victors, writing about the names of peoples. In Plato's dialogue, he boasts about performing whole ancient history, archaeologia, for audiences in Sparta. So, Hippias functioned very much like a historian, gathering stories and information about diverse cultures, much like Herodotus was doing. Hippias' most significant contribution, though, was his synagoge, his collection. Imagine it as a massive intellectual scrapbook or anthology. Fragments suggest it drew material from everywhere: venerable myths and poems attributed to Orpheus, Hesiod, Homer, recent thinkers, Greek and non-Greek. The surviving piece, likely from the beginning, lays out his ambition explicitly. I will put together from all these the ones that are most important and similar, and make this new and multiform discourse. Notice the language, new multiform kanunkai polyantan logan. This isn't just a dry list of opinions, it's presented as a novel, complex creation. Hippias positions himself as an enlightener, assembling a vast array of previously scattered or inaccessible knowledge into a coherent, albeit multifaceted, whole. He's curating the intellectual heritage of his time. Comparing Hippias' opening lines to Herodotus' famous start is fascinating. Both use similar rhetorical structures, parataxis and antithesis, and both entice their grand ambition to provide comprehensive knowledge. Herodotus focuses on events, deeds, great and marvelous things done by Greeks and barbarians. Hippias focuses on things spoken or written, again spanning Greek and non-Greek sources. The parallel is striking. Both claim encyclopedic scope, covering a wide range of human activity and thought. Rhetorically, Hippias is claiming a kind of intellectual breadth comparable to Herodotus. Both promise insight through their vast collections. Of course, both could also be criticized for being too sprawling, too unsystematic. But the very existence of this encyclopedic impulse, and the debates surrounding it, is a powerful indicator of that 5th century consciousness of progress, of an era consolidating and expanding the boundaries of knowledge and enlightenment in action. So, stepping back, even though Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates might be wildly inaccurate, Cloud still gives us a valuable, if distorted, window onto the scientific spirit of the sophistic age. We see research happening across the board: natural science with Antiphon, the social sciences like linguistics with Protagoras and Prodicus, and historical collection and presentation with Hippias. At the heart of all this is an empirical drive, connecting the sophists not just to each other, but to earlier thinkers like Anaxagoras and contemporaries like Democritus. But what sets the sophists apart, perhaps, is their emphasis on collection over building grand predictive theories. It reflects a certain epistemological modesty, a focus on what can be observed or reported directly, autopsy, rather than wild speculation. They seem more focused on social science than previous generations, but it's a spectrum. Thinkers moved fluidly between studying nature and culture. The bottom line? The sophists were major players in this vibrant, wide-ranging scientific enlightenment of their time, a role often overlooked. All right, we've explored the research side of things. But there's another prominent claim, often leveled against the sophists, which we'll need to unpack next: their alleged skill in making weaker arguments win over stronger ones. That's where the story takes another turn.